So good afternoon. It is my great honor to, on behalf of the board of the ADC, welcome Sir John Vickers, an outstanding economist whose work and thinking has influenced our understanding of competition and regulation, and whose career is an embodiment, a rare combination in between academic depth on one side and public leadership on the other. Sir John Vickers is currently warden of All Souls College of the University of Oxford, where he has led a long and influential academic career that is reflected in the work that he has published in books and many articles in highly ranked economic journals. Now, beyond university walls, Sir John has also held some of the most pivotal roles in UK economic policy. He was chief economist at the Bank of England and a member of the Monetary Policy Committee. He was then chair of the OFT, the Office of Fair Trading, and he led the institution through one of its most important changes, which was when the OFT was granted full independence in 2002. And he was also chair of the Independent Commission on Banking that was set up during the 2008 financial crisis, and which he led since the very early stages, since it was formed, until the final report was out that was highly influential for the UK financial system. Sir John, who was knighted in 2005, also held many other positions. He was president of the Royal Economic Society, of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, of the European Association for Research in Industrial Economics, and this is just a cherry picking about the many other positions that Sir John held. He holds a PhD and an MPhil in economics from the University of Oxford, and also a BA in politics, economics, philosophy, politics, and economics. I think that's the right order, from the University of Oxford. For those of you in the room that have a long-standing career in competition policy, I'm sure that you will understand me in saying that Sir John has always affirmed to be a very wise, the voice of clarity and wisdom throughout all these years. And particularly in moments where difficult messages had to be delivered. I'm just going to mention two out of many examples that I could give. The first one dates back to the 2008 financial crisis, and a very important moment, as many of you will surely remember then, was the takeover by Lloyd's TSB of HBOS. This merger escaped the usual scrutiny of the Competition Commission in spite of the concerns that was raised at the time by the OFT, and this was because it received the government waiver on the name of financial stability. And at the time, Sir John was one of the most vocal critics against this decision, this waiver. He was at the time the chairman of the Independent Commission on Banking. He called it very straight on a mistake, I believe. And as we know, history proved him right, as the merger actually led to massive taxpayer bailouts. Then the other example that I chose, about the many I could give, was the Bellamy Lecture that Sir John delivered in 2024. The Bellamy Lecture is an event that is organized by the CAT in honor of Sir Christopher Bellamy. And in this lecture, in 2004, Sir John addresses the most pressing challenges that we face in the competition community with, again, vision and clarity, and his words, I think, resonated to many of us. I remember the first time that we came across and we commented this Bellamy lecture that was then published and actually gave origin to a paper. I remember Nuno saying, "It's all there." Those were the words, it's all there, all the challenges. Sir John, welcome to Lisbon.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and especially for the invitation to this wonderful event, and seeing lots of old friends and meeting lots of new ones, so thank you.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure. And, it's a very good time to meet because it's very troubling times, which give us no comfort, no reassurance, but a lot to talk about, right? So, and I think that today was quite an example of how troubling times can give us interesting topics to discuss. At least there's some good side to it. And I would, if you allow me, start with the very fundamentals of competition policy, which is our guiding principle. In your Bellamy lecture, to which I referred earlier, you come to the rescue of the consumer welfare standard in a way. You say it's under attack from various directions. There are some that call it too lax and abstracting from aims which we all care about, like inequality and worker welfare, with all those concerns. Some say it's too interventionist, it harms economic efficiency, it prevents pro-sustainability cooperation agreements to be held. So many criticism from all sides. What is your take, John, on those criticisms?
Thank you. So that lecture was nearly a year and a half ago now. And one thing I tried to do to start with is to say, what do we mean by a consumer welfare standard? Does it make economic sense? And to what extent is it reflected in the law? And of course, the economics in the law is not a pure consumer welfare standard, but that I do think has been the main thrust of enforcement activity, and indeed the courts, including the courts in Luxembourg, have spoken quite recently and quite forthrightly about the consumer standard. So we could go into those issues, but your question is saying it's about all the other voices which were there saying, look, we need more about inequality, environment, the rise in markups, and so on. That was 18 months ago. Of course, now we've got the wind direction changes, and there are all the voices about competitiveness, growth, and so on. So where I would come out is I am skeptical of going beyond the basics, both for economic and legal reasons. I think it is silly to pretend that competition authorities can do much about all those other objectives, important though they are. So it's not to devalue their importance, but I think other bits of public policy are much better attuned to doing that. And my second worry is that if you start opening up these other issues, then there are two dangers. One is of the political economy, of new angles for people to run new kinds of arguments and to distract the competition authority from the basics. And I think this distraction risk is real. And my final heading of worry is that if remits expand, if there's mission creep, either through new interpretations of the law or new secondary or objectives in legislation and so on, and we're seeing that certainly in my country, not only in competition space but elsewhere, I think there is a danger to the constitutional position of the independent agencies. I believe in narrow, simple remits and a lot of accountability, and the politicians shouldn't interfere. The courts are above all this, but the politicians, with exceptions, shouldn't interfere. The more you go into these wider public policy areas, it's almost like an invitation for political involvement, and I think that can undermine or compromise the constitutional legitimacy of independent competition authorities. And you do have a lot of power, and when I was in that role, I had a lot of power, and I think that has to be well disciplined, with a lot of accountability, but keep it simple. And I would say the same if this was a conference about monetary policy. It would be, for me, the same point.
So I gather from your words that you don't see as a good development broadening the goals of competition law, right? In terms of how we have the law framed today, I always feel that there's some issue with the democratic legitimacy for us to make trade-offs in between different aims. But there are claims that, even there could be revisions of the law to broaden our goals. And I know that I've learned when we were preparing and we were discussing that the UK at some point had a public interest statute.
So if we wind the clock back, so when I began at the Office of Fair Trading, which was exactly 25 years ago, there was the new Competition Act that had provisions mirroring what are now Articles 101, 102 in domestic law. But merger law, and some other aspects too, the statutory test was the public interest. So that's as broad as you could imagine. There was a non-exhaustive list of components of the public interest in the law, and competition matters featured fairly prominently, but they were not the only things in that list, and it was explicit that the other things not listed could count in the public interest. The ultimate decision makers for mergers were government ministers, and I think that made perfect sense if you have a public interest test. So the Office of Fair Trading and the Monopolies and Mergers Commission, which became the Competition Commission, this was before the merger of all those into the CMA, would write reports, in effect decided a lot of things, but it was ministers who took the decisions. And their policy under successive governments of different political stripes was, with a few wobbles, to make competition the deciding factor. So de facto, it had become a competition test before it did in law. Then it did in law with a substantial lessening of competition test with the Competition Appeal Tribunal above that, and that was the accountability and the check and balance.
So you think that the movement that you experience in the UK makes it not advisable to go back to this previous model, no?
Yes, I don't think anyone's proposing going back to that, but incrementally, as you bring more and more elements into play, or as you have more and more exceptions. You mentioned the financial stability exception. There's a media plurality one. The list is edging upwards. Then we can move back to that. But I do think you lose a virtue of simplicity and accountability. And as to the democratic deficit, I mean, Parliament passed the law saying you appraise mergers on a substantial lessening of competition test, or the great bulk of them. You are the independent agency, you get on with it, the court is above you. I think that's democratically okay, and the alternatives can be significantly worse if you're not careful.
Yeah, I think John Tyrrell referred also to the simplicity as the risk of missing fuzziness when you just add too many things to our remit. Now, Sir John, let's move to innovation. Can we just turn our focus to innovation? It was discussed quite a lot today. It's central in the Draghi report. We heard Philippe Aghion earlier on this too. There's a report by Tyrrell et al. From 2024 that does a very detailed assessment of how innovation is playing out and where the gaps might be. You wrote together with Philippe Aghion and Chris Harris at the end of the 90s a paper in the Review of Economic Studies that assesses the interactions between competition and innovation and how rivalry and neck-to-neck competition can provide a lot of incentives to innovate. You called it the so-called escape competition motive, which is something that keeps appearing in our decisions because it's so intuitive. Can you tell us about those mechanisms and to the role that you expect for competition in general and competition policy in particular to have in this need to have a big transformation in the innovation system in Europe?
Large question. The thing that got me interested in this whole area was the IBM case of the early 80s, which Miguel mentioned in the last session. I had just finished my undergraduate degree, and my college tutor, Derek Morris, who went on to head the Competition Commission, was consulting on this IBM case in Paris. And it was amazingly interesting. I was little bunny assistant, that was all. But I saw, the lawyers, the economists, people like Christian von Weizsäcker, amazing people discussing all these issues. But at that point, the analytical tools of economics to think through these issues were pretty early stages. I then had the huge good fortune to do graduate work supervised by Jim Merles, who was my doctoral supervisor. And with Chris Harris, basically I was hopeless at maths, but I knew a bit about economics. Chris was like the other way around. So we were perfect complements. And we developed models of, in which the concept of neck-and-neck rivalry, these dynamic innovation games, worked. That was a thing we worked on when we were graduate students. Now, Philippe Aguillon and Peter Howitt, meanwhile, had done their Schumpeterian growth model of dramatic innovations and so on. And the paper that you described was, in essence, the plugging together of the two strands of work. And this all happened not in London, not in Oxford, but at about 80 miles an hour between the two, because Philippe and I were both living in London, working in Oxford. And there was an amazingly good train, the 10:05 from Paddington, which was cheap, half empty, and fast. And you get a table and so on. It was half empty when we got on, but 10 minutes into our discussion, we found the carriage that we were in would be entirely empty as people would move to the other carriages. And what you saw earlier, that's not animated Philippe, that's ordinary Philippe. So that's what happened. Now, moving that forward to today, I completely echo the sentiments expressed earlier about the value of having more analysis of dynamic competition, but how you do that is really, really hard. I think there are a number of cases where the static effects and the dynamic effects, whether they're positive or negative, will go in the same direction. And the really hard cases are the ones where, at least arguably, they go in opposite directions. How do you diagnose those? How do you measure those? I think we're still pretty early on in the process of making that a practical exercise.
Indeed, but right now, as an answer to the problems of the innovation ecosystem that we have, and all the bright minds in economics are telling us about ARPA models. And when you look at them, you see that there's an element of competition which is a bit different from what we have in Europe, right?
Yes, but I agree with the points a number have made, and Philippe did, that it always irritates me when in public debate it's as though there's industrial policy versus competition policy. I think the two are absolutely complementary, and there are ways, and as Philippe has, and his co-authors have detailed in that example, and as a number of the relatively more successful examples around the world of industrial policy, they very often involved really quite competitive elements, and the unsuccessful ones are throwing buckets of money at losers. I mean, I'd be very cautious about, I think there are all sorts of political and economic reasons why you've got to be very cautious about fiscally expensive industrial policy, particularly in the current very strained fiscal situation that we have. But I see those things as potentially going very much together. If I could add one point to what Philippe said, he talked about in Europe, can we have more sort of frontier breakthroughs? I think another really important innovation-related point for our economies is that there's a lot of technology which is there, but which is not being rapidly adopted by large swathes of companies in Europe's economies, and I very much include UK as part of Europe. And I think, again, I would see competition, the more efficient displacing the less efficient, being impelled by incentives to do things more efficiently and better, as absolutely the ally of productivity gains through that mechanism too.
Absolutely, but it's in defense of the resistance of the competition policy community, at least early days. I think now, we just want the direction of influence to be from competition policy to industrial policy, not the other way around, right? Because we all have bad memories about the incursions of industrial policy into competition policy, like the Siemens-Alstom saga. So I think it's understandable that we go, that it takes us a bit of faith in order to hope for pro-competitive industrial policy. So Luis was mentioning earlier the difference of theory and practice. So do you believe, if you had to make a choice, given all the, the difficulties that we know that the real deployment of industrial policy brings, would you prefer a Europe now for the future with no industrial policy at all, or to give it a go into pro-competitive industrial policy, knowing all the vulnerabilities of the deployment of industrial policy?
So this is echoing things said earlier. It seems to me that the option of no industrial policy at all, that's just not on the menu. We're going to have it in some form or another. And I think competition principles and practice can increase the odds of it being good rather than bad industrial policy.
Well, I think there's no good industrial policy if it's not pro-competitive industrial policy, right? Yeah. I think that's something that comes out of the day today, of all the discussions that we held. And despite all these positive impacts of competition for innovation, all this research, and the fact is that the public debate now is completely dominated by calls for a laxer merger control, by placing competition policy as an obstacle to wider public policy objectives. This is a familiar pattern. I was going through your papers, your writings, and you wrote in 2008, when the going gets tough, some of the not so tough seek exemptions from competition law. It sounds really relevant today. And as we are working at the Competition Authority, when you either block a merger now or you raise concerns for an in-depth investigation, which it's not something that happens every day, but the reaction is you're not listening to Draghi, right? How do you think we should deal with this, with this environment that is being created around competition law enforcement?
So it's amazing the change in 2 or 3 years, because the criticisms were coming from a totally different direction before. I remember conference after conference saying, merger policy has been woefully lax. We need to do something radically different. You had people being basically very critical of what their own organizations had been doing previously. Now it's coming from an utterly different direction, as you describe. And we've also got, in at least some jurisdictions, the pretty sharp attacks on the institutions themselves. You see that clearly now in the United States. I'm very saddened by what the UK government has done to the CMA, and it seems proud of having done it with the ejection of Marcus Bockerink as chair. So it's the institutions themselves as well as this other pressure. And as I've already indicated, I think that's a dangerous road to go down.
Indeed. And what about investment remedies? I'm sorry, but I need to, it's not an easy follow-up to the question before, but I think it's very important to speak about this.
Yes, sure. So Draghi, if I remember right, said, I thought the report was terrific on diagnosis. I thought it was not at its best on competition in telecoms. There was the proposal that markets be defined Europe-wide. Well, I totally agreed with what Lindsay said earlier. It's an empirical question what the relevant product and geographic market is. You can't just stipulate that it is something that it's not. I think he said something about the benefits of ex post versus regulation rather than merger control. I think if he'd been involved in a few more cases, maybe he'd have had a slightly modulated view. And then there was the point about investment remedies, where, I don't want to express a hardline view, but my instinct is to be very skeptical. We had a mobile phone merger in the UK. My only knowledge of it comes from newspapers and reading what the CMA said, where there was found to be a substantial lessening of competition. This was not a pan-European merger, it was very much domestic, but where the CMA saw its way to clearing the merger in exchange for an investment remedy, which by some rather, I thought, quite gymnastic logic, they seemed to think was even pro-competitive. Now, somebody earlier today, I thought, put it exactly right. if you've got a substantial lessening of competition merger, it's not just that you're going to have higher prices for a given level of cost, but you're also going to be blunting innovation rivalry. And this had better be a very credible promise of a lot more investment than would otherwise have been there for it to be net positive, would be my instinct. I also worry if we get into a world of investment remedies and you and I want to merge, then a good plan would be to go slow on investment for a year or two, and then the rabbit can come out of the hat when our merger is challenged. So I'd be much more be structural and keep the incentives in a good place rather than do deals of that kind.
Absolutely.
But you can't be an absolutist on this, but that's my leaning.
Well, you're an expert in innovation, right? To me, it sounds difficult. I'm quite skeptical to understand how can you replicate incentives to innovate by commitment, right? And it's a bit contradictory to the debate that is having now, because the issue is, if you could solve innovation problems in Europe with regulation, but I think the issue is quite the opposite, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, if the incentive was there to do the investment, you wouldn't need the commitment. So demonstrably, the incentive is not there.
Absolutely.
Absent the deal.
Well, let's broaden a bit the geography of this discussion, John. And the fact is now we are deploying competition policy in a very complex setup. You've mentioned the situations in terms of the autonomy of agencies, which is, apart from the developments in the UK, in the US, there are also some developments. Actually, Sir John kindly invited me to the Bellamy lecture last week with Bill Kovacic that spoke about this very eloquently and very with clear concern. On the other side, you also have the interdependency between competition policy and other public policies, like trade policy. Today, you apply a fine for an antitrust infringement and you risk getting a tariff back. This is a very complex game board to move in.
It clearly is. I think it's another reason why I'd be cautious about politicizing or being seen to politicize competition policy decisions, because I think if you do that, you're just setting yourself up to be on the harsh end of those games. Whereas if instead a jurisdiction says, look, we have an independent authority, they make decisions subject to the law, subject to appeal, we're not going to do deals with you on that because we politicians don't run the show. If you've started ousting people and this, that, and the other, I think you are making yourself much more vulnerable to that kind of pressure. If, on the other hand, you want to do geopolitical deals with mergers, then I suppose politicizing it is a good way to go. I think an interesting thing to look out for in all these cases coming before the US Supreme Court, there's a case of 90 years ago called Humphrey's Executor, which Bill in that lecture mentioned. There isn't time to tell the backstory or what's going on there. But on that outcome turns whether we will continue with a bipartisan FTC and other regulators in other sectors, or whether it's going to be flip-flop politically. And of course, there's the roughly parallel case involving the Fed governor, who the president has tried to oust.
Very well. So, if you could wrap up in some commandments to be written in stone, which, the competition community that is sitting here in the audience can take home, the main commandments on how we should deal with such a complex environment. I have no memory of such an environment, particularly with interdependencies in terms of policies.
So, as will have been apparent, I have a rather boring and mainstream view. I mean, I would stick to the basics. We've had enormous changes in the political weather in the last few years, of gale force from one direction and then more than that from a different direction. And I think the best thing for the authorities to do, and I'd say the same for monetary policy authorities, regulators and so on, is do the basics as well as you possibly can. And there's plenty to argue about, plenty of controversy, plenty of ways to do that better, and I think this bringing dynamic analysis better into competition policy decisions is a perfect example. So I would say do the basics better, innovate on the basis of good economics, good law, good empirical evidence with the basics. Don't go too wide and hope the weather calms down soon.
Also, we were speaking just before we joined in that in 5 minutes everything changes, right? Because, for example, looking at the US, things change very quickly. What do you think the role of institutions should be on that regard, on keeping independence, on distancing? A few good words of advice.
Well, I mean, we are in democracies, so I do think, though, that in the competition world, the kind of settlement between legislatures and governments and agencies which prevailed more or less happily for the first 20 years of this century in many and a growing number of jurisdictions, I think that was a sensible democratic settlement. It's right that it's challenged and pressurized, and as I've said, I hope it comes through those challenges well. But I think a wise legislature and a wise government would not interfere with independence, would not encourage mission creep, and let the authorities and the courts above them. We haven't talked much at all today about the courts. I know there's more tomorrow. I think that's all part of the democratic and constitutional settlement.
So we are going to hope for that until we see better weather in terms of competition policy. Thank you so much, Sir John Vickers. Can you join me in thanking John?